When Jake pulled into his daughter's school that morning, he expected to see her smile. Instead, he found her curled against a brick wall in a blizzard, lips blue, body trembling, 8 years old, and left to freeze while class continued inside. What he discovered next would ignite a firestorm that brought 250 Hell's Angels roaring into a quiet suburban town. The substitute teacher thought she could break a little girl for being too smart. She had no idea who that little girl's father was. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. The storm hit harder than the weather service predicted. By 6:30 that morning, the roads were already buried under 3 inches of fresh snow, and the wind cut through the darkness like frozen razors. Most people stayed home. Schools were calling closures. Businesses were delaying openings. But Jake wasn't most people. He had a promise to keep, and weather had never stopped him before. His daughter Sophie had left her science project at home. Not just any project, the one she'd spent 3 weeks building from scratch. A working model of the solar system with hand-painted planets and LED lights she'd wired herself. She was 8 years old and could explain gravitational pull better than most high school students. Jake had watched her hunched over that project every night after dinner, tongue between her teeth in concentration, her small fingers steady as she soldered connections and mixed paint colors until they matched NASA photographs. She'd barely slept the night before, too excited about presenting it to her class. When he dropped her off at school that morning, she'd been halfway down the hall before she'd stopped, frozen, then turned back with panic in her eyes. The project still sitting on the kitchen table. Jake had seen her face crumble, seen her fighting tears, and he'd made the decision instantly. He'd get it. He'd bring it to her. She wouldn't face that classroom empty-handed, not after everything she'd put into it. So while the storm intensified and the world shut down, Jake fired up his motorcycle. The Harley's engine roared to life in the frozen morning, a sound that had always meant freedom, power, control. He strapped Sophie's solar system carefully to the back, wrapped in waterproof canvas, secured with bungee cords he checked 3 times. The leather jacket wasn't enough for this weather, but it was what he had. The cold didn't matter. Getting this to Sophie mattered. The ride through town was brutal. Snow came at him horizontally, stinging any exposed skin, turning the world into a white tunnel with no depth, no distance, no reference points. The Harley's tires fought for traction on roads that hadn't seen a plow yet. Other vehicles were abandoned on the shoulder, their drivers having given up, but Jake leaned into the wind and kept going. His hands were numb inside his gloves. Ice was forming in his beard, but he kept seeing Sophie's face. That moment of joy she'd have when he walked into that school and handed her the project she thought she'd lost. That smile that made everything else disappear. He imagined walking through the front doors, snow-covered and ice-crusted, probably looking like something out of a winter apocalypse movie. The office staff would probably give him concerned looks. They always did when he showed up in his colors. But Sophie would hear his boots in the hallway. She'd come running. And when she saw what he was carrying, when she realized he'd ridden through a blizzard just to save her presentation, she'd throw her arms around him and everything would be worth it. Every frozen mile, every moment fighting the storm. Worth it to be the dad who showed up, who kept promises, who made sure his little girl never had to feel like she'd failed. The school was only 4 miles from their house, but it took him nearly 20 minutes to get there. 20 minutes of fighting wind and ice and near zero visibility. 20 minutes of willing the Harley to stay upright, to keep moving, to get him where he needed to be. And as he finally turned into the school parking lot, as the building emerged from the snow like a fortress, Jake felt that familiar surge of accomplishment. He'd made it. Sophie would get her project. The day was saved. He pulled into the courtyard, the small outdoor space between the main building and the gymnasium, where parents sometimes waited during pickup. The engine rumbled, echoing off brick walls, announcing his arrival. Jake killed the motor and started unwrapping the solar system, checking to make sure nothing had shifted during the ride, that all Sophie's careful work had survived the journey. He was already planning his exit. He'd slip it to her, maybe ruffle her hair, let her get back to class without too much disruption. Quick and clean. Father-daughter mission accomplished. But then he heard something over the wind. Something that didn't belong. A sound that made his blood stop moving in his veins. Small. rhythmic, desperate. Teeth chattering, not from cold, from something beyond cold, from a body shutting down, and it was coming from somewhere close, too close. Jake's head snapped up, the solar system forgotten in his hands. His eyes scanned the courtyard, searching through the swirling snow for the source of that sound. And then he saw her, a small figure pressed against the brick wall near the side entrance, curled into herself, shaking so violently he could see it from 20 feet away. Dark hair plastered to her head with snow, skin that looked gray even in the white storm, and a pink backpack he'd bought her 3 months ago for her birthday. The solar system hit the ground. Jake was running before he consciously decided to move. And in that moment, everything changed. The distance between Jake and his daughter was less than 30 feet, but it felt like miles. His boots pounded against snow-covered concrete, each step an eternity, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were telling him. This couldn't be Sophie. His Sophie, the little girl he dropped off 90 minutes ago, warm and safe, walking through those front doors into a building designed to protect children. But it was her, the pink backpack with the constellation patches she'd insisted on sewing herself, the purple mittens her grandmother had knitted, the small frame he'd recognize anywhere, now reduced to something fragile and broken against that brick wall. Time did something strange in those seconds. Everything slowed down, became hyper-focused, details burning themselves into Jake's memory with brutal clarity. The way her arms were wrapped around her knees, trying to conserve heat that was no longer there. The tremors that shook her entire body in waves, violent and uncontrollable. Her muscles contracting so hard he could see it even through her winter coat. Her lips. God, her lips were blue. Not the pale blue of someone who'd been outside too long. The deep, dark blue of oxygen deprivation, of a body losing the fight. When he reached her, when he dropped to his knees beside her, the sound that came from his chest wasn't words. It was something primal. Terror and rage and disbelief, all compressed into a single noise that got lost in the wind. His hands found her shoulders, and the cold that radiated from her small body hit him like a physical blow. She was frozen, actually frozen. The coat she wore, thick and insulated, meant nothing. The cold had gone through it, into her, taken root in her core. Sophie's eyes opened, but barely. The recognition was there. She knew her father, but everything else was confusion and exhaustion. Her teeth were chattering so hard the sound drowned out everything else. Click, 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 click. Rapid fire. Uncontrollable. She tried to speak, tried to form words, but her mouth wouldn't cooperate. Only broken sounds came out, fragments of syllables that dissolved before they became language. She reached for him with hands that could barely move, fingers that looked waxy and pale even inside her mittens. Jake tore off his leather jacket without thinking. The cold hit him immediately, cutting through his shirt, but he didn't care, didn't feel it. He wrapped the jacket around Sophie, pulling her against his chest, trying to transfer every ounce of his body heat into her. She was so small. Had she always been this small? He could feel her heart racing beneath his hands. Too fast, panicked, her body fighting a battle it didn't know how to win. The shivering intensified when he touched her, like his warmth shocked her system into recognizing how cold she actually was. He needed to get her inside, needed to get her warm, needed to understand what had happened, how this was possible, why his daughter was outside in a blizzard while school was in session. But in that moment, holding her shaking body against his, Jake's mind couldn't process anything beyond the immediate crisis. His daughter was hypothermic. His daughter was in danger. His daughter needed him. And he'd almost been too late. He scooped her up, one arm under her knees, the other supporting her back, and Sophie's head lolled against his shoulder. She weighed nothing. Felt like she might break if he held her wrong. The chattering teeth continued. That awful sound that meant her body was still trying to warm itself, still fighting. If the shivering stopped, he knew, some deep instinct told him, that would be worse, much worse. That would mean her body was giving up. The side entrance was locked. Of course it was locked. Jake kicked it once, twice, his boot leaving dents in the metal, and somewhere inside an alarm started screaming. Good. Let them hear. Let them come. Let them see what he'd found in their courtyard. He moved to the main entrance, shouldering through the double doors with Sophie clutched against him, his leather jacket dwarfing her small frame. And the warmth of the building hit them both like a wall. The contrast was obscene. Inside, everything was normal. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Bulletin boards displayed student artwork. The faint sound of a teacher's voice drifted from a nearby classroom, explaining something about multiplication tables. The smell of cafeteria food preparing for lunch. Life continuing as usual while a child froze to death 30 feet away. A teacher emerged from a classroom, saw Jake standing there dripping melted snow, saw the bundle in his arms, and her face went white. She started toward them, mouth opening to ask questions. But Jake's expression stopped her cold. He didn't have words yet, couldn't form sentences past the roar of adrenaline and terror still flooding his system. He just held Sophie tighter, felt her continued shivering, and thought one single thought that would define everything that came after. Someone did this to her. Someone put her outside. And he had no idea yet that this wasn't an accident. The school nurse's office became ground zero within minutes. Staff members materialized from classrooms and administrative offices, their faces shifting from confusion to horror as they processed what they were seeing. Jake laid Sophie on the examination table, and the nurse, a woman named Patricia, who'd been working at the school for 15 years, immediately started stripping off Sophie's wet outer layers. The coat, the mittens, the snow pants. Everything was soaked through, clinging to Sophie's skin, making the hypothermia worse with every second it stayed on. Emergency blankets appeared, the crinkly metallic kind designed to trap body heat. Patricia wrapped Sophie in 3 of them, layering them carefully, her hands steady despite the shock in her eyes. She checked Sophie's pulse, her temperature, shining a light in her eyes to check her pupils. The thermometer reading made Patricia's jaw tighten. 92.6 degrees, dangerously low. Moderate hypothermia, bordering on severe. Another 10 minutes outside and they'd be looking at organ damage. Another 20, and Sophie might not have made it at all. The principal, Mr. Anderson, stood in the doorway, looking like a man watching his career implode in real time. His mouth opened and closed, searching for words, for explanations, for anything that could make sense of this situation. Behind him, other teachers whispered urgently, their voices carrying fragments of disbelief. How long was she out there? Who was supervising? Where was her teacher? The questions multiplied, but no one had answers. Jake stood beside the examination table, his hand on Sophie's forehead, feeling the unnatural cold of her skin through the blankets. Her shivering had intensified with the warmth, which Patricia said was actually a good sign. Her body, recognizing it, needed to fight. But watching his daughter shake uncontrollably, her small face still pale, her lips slowly returning from blue to a sickly purple-pink, Jake felt something dangerous solidifying in his chest. Not the hot, explosive rage he'd felt outside. Something colder, more controlled, more permanent. He turned to Mr. Anderson, and when he spoke, his voice came out like gravel scraping across concrete. 3 words that cut through all the nervous chatter. Where were you? The principal flinched, started to answer with administrative speak, with carefully constructed phrases designed to deflect responsibility. But Jake's expression stopped him. This wasn't a question seeking excuses. It was an accusation, a demand, a line being drawn in the sand. Where were all of you? Jake continued, his voice low enough that everyone had to lean in to hear. My daughter was outside for... He looked at Patricia. Based on her core temperature and exposure symptoms, at least 45 minutes, the nurse said quietly. Possibly longer. 45 minutes, Jake repeated, letting the number hang in the air like an indictment. In a blizzard, while school was in session, while every one of you was inside these warm buildings doing your jobs, where the hell were you? Mr. Anderson turned to his assistant principal, a younger man named Wilson, who'd been frantically checking his tablet, pulling up schedules and attendance records. What class was Sophie in this morning? Who was her teacher? Wilson's face went pale as he found the information. Room 214, 3rd grade science. But Mrs. Peterson is out on medical leave. The substitute today was, he scrolled, Miss Bennett. The name meant nothing to Jake yet. just syllables. But he filed it away, his mind already building a case, cataloging details, preparing for whatever came next. "Get her," he said, "now!" Someone was dispatched. The office fell into tense silence, broken only by the continued rustling of Sophie's emergency blankets and her gradually slowing shivers. Patricia brought warm liquids, trying to get Sophie to sip sweet tea, coaxing her body temperature back toward normal. And Jake waited, his hand never leaving his daughter's arm, his knuckles white where they gripped the edge of the examination table. It was Sophie who broke the silence. Her voice came out rough, damaged from the cold, barely above a whisper. But in that quiet room, everyone heard her. "Daddy?" Jake leaned down immediately, his face level with hers. "I'm here, baby, right here." "I'm sorry about the project." Her eyes filled with tears, and the fact that this was what she was worried about, not what had happened to her, but disappointing him, nearly broke something in Jake's chest. "Hey, no, don't you dare apologize." He brushed hair back from her forehead, his touch gentle despite the fury building inside him. "The project doesn't matter. You matter. That's all. Just you." Sophie's lip trembled. "But I worked so hard." "I know you did, and we'll figure it out. But first," he took a breath, forcing his voice to stay calm, "I need you to tell me something. How did you end up outside?" The room held its breath. Every staff member present leaned in, suddenly understanding that whatever Sophie said next would define everything that followed. Patricia's hands stilled on the blanket she was adjusting. Mr. Anderson took a step closer. Wilson's fingers hovered over his tablet, ready to document. Sophie's eyes dropped, shame flooding her small face. "I answered a question wrong." "What?" Jake's voice sharpened, despite his efforts to control it. "In science class, Miss Bennett asked about planetary orbits, and I answered. But she said I was showing off, that I was being disrespectful, that I needed to learn humility." Sophie's voice cracked. "She told me to go outside and think about respecting adults." The words landed like grenades in the small office. Jake felt the temperature of his blood drop, felt something crystallize in his core that was far more dangerous than heat. "Miss Bennett sent you outside?" he repeated, his voice deadly quiet. "The substitute teacher, she ordered you out into a blizzard?" Sophie nodded, tears spilling over now. "I tried to tell her it was really cold, but she said maybe the cold would cool down my smart mouth. She opened the door and told me to go. And when I was out there, I tried to come back in, but—" Her voice broke. The door was locked. The nurse's sharp intake of breath was audible. Mr. Anderson looked like he might be sick, and Jake felt the world narrow to a single point of focus, a single name that now carried the weight of everything that had been done to his daughter. Miss Bennett. What Jake learned next would make his blood run colder than the storm outside. But in that moment, with Sophie's confession hanging in the air and the full horror of deliberate cruelty settling over everyone present, one thing became absolutely certain. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice, and someone was going to answer for it. The investigation began before anyone officially called it that. While Patricia continued monitoring Sophie's recovery, while Mr. Anderson made frantic phone calls to the district superintendent, Jake started asking questions. Not loudly, not with threats. Just methodical, persistent questions directed at anyone who might have seen something, heard something, known something. And what emerged over the next hour painted a picture far more disturbing than a single moment of poor judgment. Miss Bennett wasn't a stranger to this school. She'd been substitute teaching in the district for 3 years, cycling through different buildings, different grade levels, always available when regular teachers needed coverage. Most staff knew her by sight, if not by name. But what became clear as Jake talked to teachers in hushed conversations outside the nurse's office was that Miss Bennett came with baggage. She had a daughter, Madison Bennett, 9 years old, 4th grade, struggling academically in ways that clearly caused her mother significant distress. One teacher, Mrs. Chen, admitted quietly that she'd heard Miss Bennett in the staff lounge more than once, complaining about how the school was pushing her daughter too hard, expecting too much, not understanding that some children just develop differently. The complaints always had an edge to them, a bitterness that made other teachers uncomfortable. Mrs. Chen had witnessed Miss Bennet looking through student work posted on hallway bulletin boards, her face darkening when she saw projects that outshone what her daughter could produce. There was jealousy there, resentment, a mother's protective instinct twisted into something toxic. And Sophie's name had come up before, specifically Sophie's name, because Sophie was everything Madison Bennet wasn't. Bright in a way that couldn't be hidden or downplayed, curious, enthusiastic, the kind of student who asked questions that pushed lessons further, who connected concepts across subjects, who made learning look effortless when other children struggled. In a school environment that celebrated academic achievement, Sophie shined. And for Miss Bennet, watching from the sidelines as a substitute teacher, seeing this 8-year-old excel while her own daughter fought for every passing grade, that shine must have felt like salt in an open wound. Wilson, the assistant principal, pulled class rosters and discovered something that made the situation even darker. This wasn't the first time Miss Bennet had been Sophie's substitute teacher. She'd covered Mrs. Peterson's class twice before over the past month when the regular teacher had doctor's appointments. Two previous interactions, two previous opportunities to observe Sophie, to build resentment, to let that bitterness calcify into something actionable. A student teacher who'd been in the room during one of those earlier sessions recalled Miss Bennet making pointed comments when Sophie raised her hand. Little digs disguised as redirection. Let's give someone else a chance to answer, Sophie. I'm sure you're not the only smart one here. Or, maybe instead of always knowing everything, you could let your classmates think for themselves. The kind of comments that felt wrong but weren't quite serious enough to report. Microaggressions designed to diminish, to make a confident child second-guess herself. But it was the interviews with Sophie's classmates that revealed just how calculated this morning had been. Mr. Anderson brought them in one by one, away from their parents initially, just gentle questions about what they'd witnessed. The children were nervous, their voices small, clearly afraid of getting in trouble or saying the wrong thing. But they told the truth, and the truth was damning. Miss Bennet had started class that morning by announcing a special challenge question. She told the students that this was a difficult concept, something even fifth graders struggled with, and she wanted to see if anyone could figure it out. The question involved planetary orbits, specifically why planets closer to the sun orbited faster than those farther away. It was advanced material, well beyond third-grade curriculum. Several children tried to answer and got it wrong, which Miss Bennet met with exaggerated sympathy. "Oh, that's okay. This is really hard. Don't feel bad." Then Sophie raised her hand. According to every child who witnessed it, Sophie explained Kepler's laws in language an 8-year-old could understand. Talking about orbital velocity and gravitational pull, making connections to the science project that was probably still lying in the snow outside where Jake had dropped it. Her explanation was clear, accurate, confident, the kind of answer that should have made a teacher proud. Instead, the classroom had erupted in laughter. Not at Sophie, at Miss Bennet, because Sophie had just demonstrated to 23 third graders that their substitute teacher had asked a question expecting them to fail, and an 8-year-old had made it look easy. The children weren't laughing at the answer. They were laughing at the shocked expression on Miss Bennet's face, at the way she'd clearly been caught off guard, at the sudden shift in power dynamics when a child proved smarter than the adult in the room. One student, a boy named Tyler, described what happened next with painful clarity. Miss Bennet's face had gone red, her hands had clenched into fists at her sides, and she'd stared at Sophie for a long moment before speaking in a voice that made everyone stop laughing. "That's enough, Sophie. I think your attitude shows exactly why your generation has no respect for authority. You think being smart means you can show up your teachers? Make everyone else look stupid?" Sophie had tried to apologize, Tyler said, had looked confused like she didn't understand what she'd done wrong. But Miss Bennet hadn't let her speak, had told her that maybe sometime outside would teach her humility, that the cold might cool down her smart mouth, that when she was ready to come back inside and apologize to the entire class for her disrespect, maybe then she'd be allowed back in. The other children had watched Sophie walk to the door, had seen her hesitate, had heard her ask if she could at least get her coat from her locker. Miss Bennet had said no, had opened the door to the courtyard, the side entrance that led directly outside, and told Sophie to go now. And when Sophie had walked out into that blizzard, when the door closed behind her and the lock clicked into place, Miss Bennet had turned back to the class and continued the lesson as if nothing had happened. 23 children had sat in that classroom while their classmate froze outside. None of them had understood it was an emergency. They'd thought Sophie was just in trouble, that she'd be let back in soon, that adults knew what they were doing. Children trust that teachers will keep them safe. Every single one of those students would carry the guilt of their silence, even though they bore no responsibility for what happened. But the question that destroyed Miss Bennet's control wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't a trap that backfired. It was a moment when a teacher's jealousy and insecurity collided with a child's innocent brilliance. And the result was a choice that crossed every line, violated every trust, and revealed exactly what kind of person had been given authority over vulnerable children. Outside, Sophie's science project lay buried in fresh snow, a symbol of the intelligence that had been punished instead of celebrated. And inside, Jake listened to these accounts with a stillness that scared the adults around him more than any shouting would have. Because this wasn't just cruelty. This was premeditated. This was personal. And Miss Bennet had picked the wrong child's mother to resent. To understand what happened in room 214 that morning, you have to go back to 8:45, when 23 third graders filed into their classroom, shaking snow from their coats, chattering about the storm, expecting a normal day. Miss Bennet stood at the front of the room, her posture rigid, her expression already tight with something that looked like determination. She'd been thinking about this moment since she'd seen her name on the substitute assignment. Mrs. Peterson's third grade science class, Sophie's class, an opportunity. The morning announcements crackled through the intercom, the Pledge of Allegiance, reminders about hot lunch options and library book returns. Standard routine that gave Miss Bennet time to watch the students settle into their seats. Her eyes tracking to one desk in particular. Second row, third seat back, where Sophie sat arranging her pencils, organizing her notebook, completely unaware that she'd already been marked as the target before class even began. Miss Bennet started with pleasantries, introduced herself, even though many of the students already knew her from previous substituting assignments. Explained that Mrs. Peterson was at a doctor's appointment and would be back tomorrow. Then she moved to the board and wrote a single question in careful capital letters. Why do planets closer to the sun orbit faster than planets farther away? She turned back to the class with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. This is a really challenging question, she announced, her voice taking on that particular tone adults use when they're about to watch children fail. Even fifth graders struggle with this concept, but I thought you bright third graders might want to give it a try. Who thinks they know the answer? Several hands went up tentatively. Miss Bennet called on a boy named Connor, who guessed it had something to do with the sun being hot. Wrong, but Miss Bennet responded with exaggerated warmth. Oh, that's such good thinking, Connor. You're on the right track. The sun is definitely important. She called on another student, a girl named Emma, who suggested maybe smaller planets move faster. Also wrong. Wonderful creative thinking, Emma. I love how your brain works. 3 more students tried. 3 more gentle corrections wrapped in praise. And with each wrong answer, Miss Bennet's satisfaction became more visible, her smile more genuine. This was going exactly as planned. She was demonstrating that this was hard, that struggling was normal, that not knowing was okay, setting up a dynamic where failure was expected and accepted. Then Sophie raised her hand, small, certain, her expression showing none of the nervousness the other students had displayed. Miss Bennet's jaw tightened for just a fraction of a second before she schooled her features back into neutrality. Yes, Sophie. Sophie stood the way students were taught to do when answering questions. Her voice was clear, enthusiastic, completely innocent of the trap she was walking into. It's because of Kepler's laws of planetary motion. Planets closer to the sun have shorter orbital paths, so even though they're moving through space, they have less distance to cover. But also, the sun's gravitational pull is stronger when you're closer, so it pulls the planets faster. It's like, imagine swinging a ball on a string. If you make the string shorter, The ball goes around faster. The sun's gravity is like that string, and the closer planets are like the ball on the shorter string. The explanation was perfect. Clear enough for third graders to visualize, scientifically accurate, demonstrating understanding that went beyond memorization into genuine comprehension. Sophie even made hand motions, illustrating the orbital mechanics. Her face lit up with the joy of sharing knowledge she found fascinating. And the classroom laughed. Not mean laughter, not mocking. The laughter of children who just watched their substitute teacher get outsmarted by their 8-year-old classmate, who'd seen an adult set up a question designed to prove something was too hard, only to watch someone their age make it look simple. The laughter of kids recognizing something funny about the power dynamic shift, about Miss Bennett's carefully constructed demonstration, crumbling in real time. Miss Bennett's face transformed. The false warmth evaporated, replaced by something cold and sharp. Her cheeks flushed red, not from embarrassment, but from rage. Her hands, which had been loose at her sides, curled into fists. And when she spoke, her voice cut through the laughter like a blade, silencing the room instantly. That's enough. 2 words, flat and hard. Sophie, sit down. Sophie sat, her smile fading, confusion replacing enthusiasm. The other students exchanged glances, suddenly aware they'd crossed some invisible line, though none of them understood what or how. Miss Bennett walked slowly toward Sophie's desk, her footsteps deliberate. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet enough that students had to strain to hear, which somehow made it more frightening. You think you're very smart, don't you, Sophie? Smarter than everyone else? Smarter than me? No, Sophie started, but Miss Bennett cut her off. You think because you can memorize some facts and repeat them back, that makes you better than your classmates? Better than the adults trying to teach you? That kind of arrogance, that disrespect for authority? That's what's wrong with children today. No humility, no understanding that being smart doesn't make you superior. Sophie's eyes were wide now, filling with tears. I'm sorry. I didn't mean... Maybe some time outside will help you think about respecting your elders, Miss Bennett continued, her voice getting colder with each word. Maybe the cold will cool down that smart mouth of yours. Stand up. Sophie stood, trembling now, not understanding what was happening, but recognizing that she was in serious trouble for reasons she couldn't grasp. Miss Bennett walked to the side door, the one that led directly to the exterior courtyard, and opened it. Snow and wind immediately blasted into the classroom, making the nearest students gasp and pull away from the sudden cold. Miss Bennett, it's really cold out there, Sophie said, her voice small. Then maybe you should have thought about that before showing off. Miss Bennett's hand was on the door handle, holding it open, waiting. Out, now. Can I at least get my coat from my locker? Sophie's voice was barely audible. No, out. Sophie walked toward the door, each step slower than the last. Looking back at her classmates as if hoping someone would intervene, would say this wasn't right. But they were 8 and 9 years old, and adults were supposed to know what they were doing. So they watched, silent and scared, as Sophie stepped through that doorway into the blizzard, her thin sweater immediately inadequate against the wind. The door closed behind her. And here's where the story gets darker, where the cruelty becomes undeniable. Miss Bennett didn't just close the door, she turned the lock. The deadbolt that was meant to keep dangerous people out, she used to keep a child outside. The click echoed in the quiet classroom, a sound that several students would later tell investigators they'd never forget. Sophie stood at that door for 3 minutes, knocking. The students could hear it, a small rhythmic tapping against the metal, barely audible over the wind, but impossible to ignore. Some of the children looked at Miss Bennett, expecting her to relent, to let Sophie back in. But Miss Bennett had returned to the front of the classroom and picked up her lesson plan as if nothing unusual had happened. Now let's talk about the water cycle, she said, her voice steady and professional. The knocking continued. Tap, tap, tap. Softer now, more desperate. A child asking to be let back into warmth and safety. And then after those 3 minutes, it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. Sophie had given up, had accepted that the door wasn't going to open, had turned away to find whatever shelter she could in a courtyard with none. And inside room 214, Miss Bennett taught the water cycle while a little girl's core temperature dropped degree by dangerous degree just beyond that locked door. 23 children sat in their seats, most of them staring at that door instead of the board, wondering when Sophie would be allowed back in, trusting that adults knew what was safe, that teachers would never actually hurt them. That trust, placed in someone who had weaponized her authority to punish a child for being intelligent, was perhaps the cruelest part of all. 47 minutes. That's how long Sophie was outside. 47 minutes that felt like hours, that stretched into an eternity, measured not in time, but in the progressive shutdown of a small body, fighting cold it was never meant to endure. To understand what happened during those minutes is to understand how close this story came to ending in tragedy instead of justice. The courtyard offered almost no shelter. It was a utilitarian space designed for student movement between buildings, not for protection from the elements. Brick walls on three sides created a wind tunnel effect, channeling the blizzard's fury into a concentrated blast that hit anyone standing there from multiple angles at once. There was an overhang above the door, maybe 3 feet of coverage, but the wind drove the snow horizontally, making the overhang meaningless. And Sophie, in her thin cotton sweater and school pants, had nothing that could defend against weather like this. The first few minutes, she tried to stay by the door, pressed herself against it, hands tucked under her arms, drawing her knees up to conserve whatever warmth her body could generate. She was still knocking periodically, not the steady tapping from before, but sporadic attempts, weaker each time, hope fading with each unanswered knock. Her teeth chattered so hard she bit her tongue, tasted copper. The cold attacked every exposed inch of skin, her face, her neck, her hands. It felt like needles, then knives, then a deeper ache that spread into her bones. She tried calling out, "Miss Bennett, please, I'm really cold." Her voice was small, barely audible over the wind, and it went nowhere. The door was solid metal, insulated, designed to keep sound out. Inside, class continued. Outside, a child begged to be heard and wasn't. After about 10 minutes, when the door remained locked and the cold became unbearable, Sophie made a decision that probably saved her life. She moved, found the corner where two brick walls met, offering slightly more wind protection than standing exposed by the door. She curled into the smallest shape possible, back against the wall, knees to chest, arms wrapped around her legs, making herself tiny, reducing surface area, some animal instinct for survival taking over where her 8-year-old understanding couldn't reach. The storm intensified. What had been merely brutal became genuinely dangerous. Wind speeds picked up, driving the snow harder, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The temperature, already below freezing, felt even colder with the wind chill factored in. Meteorologists would later calculate that the conditions Sophie endured were equivalent to standing in 10-degree weather for 47 minutes in a sweater. Other people passed during that time, not close enough to see into the courtyard, but close enough that if anyone had looked, if anyone had glanced out a window at the right moment, they might have seen her. A janitor walked through the adjacent hallway, pushing a cart of cleaning supplies, his attention on his work. A teacher hurried from one building to another, head down against the wind, focused on getting inside quickly. The gym teacher stood at a window on the second floor, looking out at the storm, shaking her head at the weather's severity, never noticing the small figure curled in the courtyard below. How many opportunities were there to save her? How many moments where if someone had just looked, had just noticed, the nightmare could have ended, but no one looked, and Sophie stayed there, alone. Her body fighting a battle it was biologically incapable of winning. The shivering that had started immediately, that violent, full-body trembling that chattered her teeth and made her muscles ache, was her body's defense mechanism, generating heat through rapid muscle contractions, burning energy to stay alive. But that defense has a limit. Around the 20-minute mark, Sophie's shivering became less coordinated. Instead of productive warmth generation, it turned into sporadic spasms, her body systems beginning to fail. She was burning through her limited energy reserves, and there was no fuel left to burn. Her hands went numb first. She couldn't feel her fingers anymore, couldn't make them move properly when she tried. Then her feet, the numbness creeping up her legs like rising water. Her thinking became fuzzy, confused. She couldn't remember exactly why she was outside anymore, just that she was cold and wanted her dad and needed to be warm. The clarity of thought that had gotten her in trouble, that brilliant mind that could explain orbital mechanics, was dimming like a light losing power. Around the 35-minute mark, something even more dangerous happened. The shivering stopped. Not because she was warming up, but because her body had given up on that defense mechanism. Her core temperature had dropped low enough that her system began prioritizing vital organs, shutting down everything non-essential. Blood flow redirected away from her extremities, away from her skin, concentrating around her heart and lungs and brain. The stopping of shivers, which might seem like relief, was actually the body's white flag. The point where hypothermia transitions from dangerous to potentially fatal. Sophie's head drooped forward. Her eyes kept closing, and she had to force them open, some deep instinct warning her that falling asleep would be bad, though she couldn't articulate why anymore. Her lips, already blue, darkened further. Her breathing slowed. She wasn't producing enough heat to melt the snow that accumulated on her shoulders, in her hair, against her back. She was becoming part of the storm. A small, frozen statue that used to be a little girl. If Jake had arrived 5 minutes later, this story would have ended very differently. 5 more minutes of core temperature dropping, of organs struggling to function, of a brain starving for warm, oxygenated blood. 5 more minutes might have meant permanent damage. Might have meant a very different kind of hospital visit. Might have meant coming home to find his daughter gone in a way that no amount of rage or justice could reverse, but he came when he did. Rode through that blizzard with a science project strapped to his bike, imagining a smile, having no idea he was racing against a clock that was seconds from running out. The moment his motorcycle rumbled into that courtyard, the moment he heard her teeth chattering over the engine noise, was the moment fate decided Sophie would survive. Barely, dangerously, but survive. And as Jake had carried her inside, as the warmth began the slow process of bringing her back from the edge, one question would haunt everyone who learned what happened. How does a child suffer like that for that long, in a place designed to keep children safe? And no one notices until it's almost too late? The ambulance arrived within 12 minutes of Jake's call. Paramedics loaded Sophie onto a stretcher, still wrapped in those metallic emergency blankets, her small body dwarfed by the equipment around her. Jake rode alongside her, his hand never leaving hers, watching monitors display numbers that confirmed what he already knew. His daughter had come dangerously close to a threshold no child should ever approach. Core temperature still hovering at 93 degrees. Heart rate elevated as her body fought to compensate. Blood pressure readings that made the paramedics exchange looks with each other. At the hospital, doctors moved quickly. Warmed IV fluids, heated blankets, constant monitoring. The diagnosis came back within an hour. Moderate hypothermia, with risk factors for complications. She'd need observation, possibly overnight, to ensure no organ damage had occurred from the prolonged cold exposure. The attending physician, a woman named Dr. Martinez, pulled Jake aside and told him something he'd never forget. Another 10 to 15 minutes in those conditions, and we'd be having a very different conversation. You got to her just in time. Just in time. The words echoed in Jake's mind as he sat beside Sophie's hospital bed, watching her sleep, her color slowly returning, her breathing steadying. Just in time implied how close they'd come to not in time, how narrow the margin had been between this outcome and something unspeakable. And as that reality settled into his bones, something crystallized in Jake's thinking. This wasn't going to be handled with angry words and threats. This wasn't going to be resolved with intimidation or violence. This required something more calculated, more permanent, more devastating to the people responsible than anything his fist could accomplish. He started with his phone. While Sophie slept, while nurses checked her vitals every 15 minutes, Jake began documenting everything. He photographed the hospital bracelet on her wrist with its admission time and diagnosis codes. He photographed the IV line, the warming blankets, the monitor displaying her vital signs. He asked Dr. Martinez for copies of all medical reports, all test results, everything that would establish the severity of what had happened. Dr. Martinez, understanding immediately where this was heading, provided them without hesitation and added her own observations to the official record. Then Jake called his lawyer. Not the criminal defense attorney he'd used once years ago for a minor motorcycle violation, but a family law specialist named Rebecca Walsh, who'd built her reputation on cases involving child welfare and educational negligence. He explained the situation in clipped, controlled sentences, and Rebecca's response was immediate. Don't talk to anyone from the school without me present. Don't sign anything. And document everything. I mean everything. So that's what Jake did. Once Sophie was stable, once the doctors assured him she'd be fine with continued warming and rest, he left her in the care of nurses and his mother, who'd rushed to the hospital the moment she heard. And he went back to the school, not for confrontation, for evidence. The courtyard was still there, exactly as he'd left it. Snow continued falling, already covering the spot where Sophie had been curled against the wall. But Jake knew where to look. He photographed the corner where she'd tried to shelter. The locked door from the outside, showing the handle, the deadbolt, the lack of any emergency release, the complete absence of any covering or protection, the distance from the door to the corner, 17 feet. He measured it, documenting how far she'd had to move to find even minimal wind protection. He photographed the windows of adjacent buildings, showing sight lines, proving that if anyone had looked, they could have seen her. Inside, Principal Anderson tried to intercept him. Mr. Stevens, I understand you're upset, but perhaps we should discuss this in my office. I'm not discussing anything, Jake said, his voice flat. I'm documenting a crime scene. The word crime hung in the air like an accusation. Anderson's face went pale. Now let's not jump to conclusions. This was clearly an unfortunate misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? Jake turned to face him fully. A teacher locks an 8-year-old outside during a blizzard for 47 minutes, and you're calling it a misunderstanding? Miss Bennett claims Sophie was being disruptive, that she only intended a brief timeout. A timeout in sub-zero weather? Without a coat? With the door locked? Jake's phone was recording now, capturing every word Anderson said. Tell me, Mr. Anderson, what's your district policy on outdoor discipline during severe weather? Anderson's mouth opened and closed. There was no policy because no one had ever imagined needing one. No reasonable person would think sending a child outside during a blizzard was ever acceptable under any circumstances. Jake continued through the building, and Anderson, understanding he couldn't stop this without making things worse, didn't try. Jake photographed the classroom, room 214, empty now, students dismissed for the day. But the layout told its own story. The side door that led to the courtyard, the deadbolt that could only be locked from inside, the 24 desks where children had sat while their classmate froze, the board still showing remnants of Miss Bennett's lesson on the water cycle, taught while Sophie's body temperature dropped. He found students still in the building, waiting for late pickups or attending after-school programs. With parents present and permission granted, he asked them gentle questions, not leading, not angry, just asking what they'd seen. And the students, relieved to finally tell someone what had been eating at them all day, talked. They described the trap question, the laughter that had triggered Miss Bennett's rage, Sophie's confusion and fear, the locked door and the knocking that had eventually stopped. One girl, a classmate named Olivia, started crying as she described how guilty she felt for not speaking up, for not doing something. You were following the rules, Jake told her quietly. You trusted that adults knew what they were doing. This isn't your fault. None of this is your fault. But it was someone's fault. And Jake was systematically building the documentation to prove exactly whose. The school district's response started coming through official channels by late afternoon. Carefully worded statements about conducting an internal investigation, assurances that student safety was their highest priority, suggestions that perhaps Miss Bennett had used poor judgment, but certainly hadn't intended any harm, the language of institutions protecting themselves. Minimizing liability, trying to frame criminal negligence as an unfortunate lapse in judgment. Rebecca Walsh reviewed everything Jake sent her, the photos, the medical records, the witness statements, the school's defensive communications, and her response was succinct. We're not negotiating with them, we're destroying them. because Jake wasn't filing a complaint. He wasn't asking for an apology or demanding Miss Bennett's dismissal or seeking a settlement that would make this go away quietly. He was building a case that would bring down everyone responsible. A case that would expose the negligence not just of one substitute teacher, but of an entire system that had given her authority over children without adequate screening, training, or oversight. A case that would ensure no parent ever had to find their child frozen and near death because someone in a position of trust decided to weaponize weather as punishment. The medical reports documented the danger. The photographs documented the scene. The witness statements documented the cruelty. And Jake's methodical collection of every piece of evidence, every contradiction in the school story, every attempt to downplay or deflect, documented the cover-up. By the time evening fell, by the time Jake returned to the hospital to find Sophie awake and asking for him, he had everything he needed. Not for justice. Justice was too small a word. For accountability, for consequences, for making sure that when people heard Sophie's name, they'd remember what happened when someone tried to punish intelligence and got away with it. Except they weren't going to get away with it. If you believe no child should ever be punished for being intelligent, if you believe what happened to Sophie was wrong at every level, then understand this. What came next wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure this never happened to another child. It was about drawing a line so clear, so bright, so enforced with consequences that anyone who even thought about harming a student would remember Sophie's story and think twice. Jake kissed his daughter's forehead, felt her warmth returning, and made a silent promise. This would not be forgotten. This would not be minimized. This would not be swept under any bureaucratic rug. Miss Bennett would answer for what she'd done, and the system that enabled her would be held accountable for every second Sophie spent freezing while they failed to protect her. The building of the case was complete. Now came the reckoning. Rebecca Walsh filed the lawsuit at 11:47 the next morning. Not the preliminary paperwork, not a notice of intent. The full complaint, 63 pages of meticulously documented allegations backed by medical evidence, witness testimony, photographic proof, and expert analysis. She bypassed every opportunity for quiet settlement, every chance for the district to handle this internally, and went straight to civil court with a case so comprehensive that the clerk processing it actually stopped reading halfway through to call her supervisor. The lawsuit named everyone, Miss Bennett personally, for child endangerment, negligent infliction of emotional distress, and willful misconduct. The school district for negligent hiring, inadequate supervision, and failure to protect. Principal Anderson for administrative negligence. The damages sought weren't just compensatory, they were punitive, designed to send a message that would resonate through every school board meeting and administrative decision for years to come. Rebecca was asking for an amount that would make headlines, that would force the district to explain to taxpayers how their money was being spent to settle a case where a teacher locked a child outside to freeze. But the lawsuit was only the beginning, because what Rebecca understood, what Jake understood, was that civil liability and criminal accountability were two different beasts, and this situation demanded both. Dr. Martinez, the emergency room physician who treated Sophie, was a mandatory reporter. State law required her to report any suspected child abuse or endangerment to authorities, and hypothermia resulting from deliberate exposure absolutely qualified. She'd filed her report with Child Protective Services before Sophie had even been discharged from the hospital, and CPS, reviewing the medical evidence and Jake's documentation, had immediately forwarded everything to the police. By early afternoon, detectives from the Criminal Investigations Unit were involved. This wasn't being handled by school resource officers or local patrol. This was a felony investigation. And the detectives assigned to it, a veteran investigator named Richards and his partner Kim, approached it with the seriousness it deserved. They reviewed Rebecca's documentation, interviewed hospital staff, visited the school, reconstructed the timeline with forensic precision. Then they called Miss Bennett in for questioning. She arrived at the station at 3:15, accompanied by a union representative who clearly hadn't grasped the severity of the situation. The representative was prepared for an employment dispute, maybe a termination hearing. He wasn't prepared for a criminal investigation with detectives who'd already built a case that could result in prison time. The interview was recorded, as all such interviews are, and the transcript would later become part of the public record. Miss Bennett started with confidence, with the authority of someone who'd spent years in positions of power over children and expected that authority to protect her now. But authority means nothing in an interrogation room when the evidence is overwhelming. Detective Richards started with simple questions. Had she been the substitute teacher for room 214 on the day in question? Yes. Had there been an incident involving a student named Sophie Stevens? Her expression tightened slightly, but yes. Could she describe what happened? This is where Miss Bennett made her first critical mistake. She tried to control the narrative, tried to frame Sophie as a disruptive student who'd been disrespectful, who'd needed discipline, who'd been sent outside briefly as a consequence for her behavior. The child was being disruptive, she said, her voice taking on that professional educator tone. She was showing off, making other students uncomfortable with her know-it-all attitude. I sent her outside to cool down and reflect on her behavior. It was a standard timeout. Detective Kim, who'd been silent until now, leaned forward. A standard timeout? In a blizzard? Without a coat? Well, I didn't think... Miss Bennett caught herself, realizing the admission she'd almost made. You didn't think what? Richards pressed. That it was cold? That a child in a sweater might be in danger in sub-zero temperatures? The union representative tried to intervene, suggested his client didn't have to answer that. But Miss Bennett was already defensive, already trying to justify decisions that couldn't be justified. Children are coddled these days, a little cold wouldn't hurt her. It was meant to teach her a lesson about respect. How long was she outside? Kim asked. 5 minutes, maybe 10 at most. Richard slid a document across the table. The medical report with its timestamp of when Jake brought Sophie inside and the doctor's estimate of exposure duration. The medical evidence says 47 minutes. 47 minutes in conditions that resulted in moderate hypothermia. Would you like to revise your statement? Miss Bennett's face flushed. The time must have gotten away from me. I was teaching. I had 23 other students to think about. 23 other students watched you lock that door, Kim said quietly. We have statements from 16 of them. They all describe the same thing. You asked a question intended to be difficult. When Sophie answered correctly and other students laughed, you sent her outside and locked the door behind her. They heard her knocking for 3 minutes. She knocked on that door and you ignored her. I was trying to teach her a lesson. You were trying to punish her for being intelligent, Richards cut in. Multiple witnesses describe a pattern of behavior. Comments you made about your own daughter struggling academically. Resentment towards students who excelled. This wasn't about discipline, Miss Bennett. This was personal. The interview continued for another hour, and with each question, Miss Bennett's story fell apart. She contradicted herself, changed details, admitted to things she didn't realize were admissions. The union representative finally managed to stop the interview, but the damage was done. Everything Miss Bennett had said, every attempt to minimize and deflect and justify, was recorded, and all of it would be used against her. Richards and Kim stepped out of the interview room and conferred with the assistant district attorney who'd been monitoring the interview remotely. The decision took less than 5 minutes. They had probable cause. They had evidence of intentional child endangerment. They had a confession, however reluctant, that established mens rea, criminal intent. An arrest warrant was justified. The prosecutor signed off on the charges that evening. Child endangerment in the first degree, willful neglect of a minor, abuse of authority, each charge carrying the possibility of years in prison, each one documenting a different aspect of the same unforgivable act. The warrant was issued, signed by a judge who'd read the medical reports and looked at the photographs of that snow-covered courtyard and understood exactly what kind of danger Sophie had faced. What happened next would echo through every school district in the state, because this wasn't going to be handled quietly. This wasn't going to be plea bargained down to a minor offense. The prosecutor, understanding the public interest and the need for accountability, made a decision to pursue this case aggressively, to make an example that would remind every educator, every administrator, every person given authority over children that power comes with responsibility, and betraying that responsibility has consequences. The system, often slow and bureaucratic and frustrating, moved with unusual speed and purpose. Within 36 hours of Sophie being found freezing in that courtyard, the machinery of justice was fully engaged. The lawsuit threatened the district's budget. The criminal charges threatened Miss Bennett's freedom. And everyone involved knew that this case would be watched, scrutinized, judged by parents across the state who sent their children to school every day, trusting that those children would be safe. The system was moving. And Miss Bennett, who'd locked the door thinking she could teach a lesson about humility, was about to learn a lesson about accountability that would define the rest of her life. The police arrived at 2:45 in the afternoon during dismissal. Not by accident. The timing was deliberate, chosen by prosecutors who understood that public accountability sometimes requires public witness. Two unmarked cars pulled up to the main entrance just as parents were lining up for pickup, just as buses were loading, just as the normal chaos of the school day's end was reaching its peak. Detectives Richards and Kim walked through those front doors with the kind of calm purpose that comes from knowing exactly what you're doing and why it matters. They asked for Miss Bennett at the main office, and the secretary's face went pale as she picked up the phone. Within minutes, Miss Bennett appeared from the faculty lounge, coffee cup in hand, clearly annoyed at being summoned. She saw the detectives and her expression shifted, recognition and fear flickering across her features in rapid succession. "Miss Angela Bennett?" Richards asked, though they both knew the answer. "Yes." Her voice was steady, but her hand trembled slightly, coffee rippling in the cup. "I'm Detective Richards. This is Detective Kim. We have a warrant for your arrest." He held up the document so she could see the judge's signature, the official seal, the list of charges typed in formal legal language. Child endangerment in the first degree, willful neglect of a minor, abuse of authority. The coffee cup slipped from her hand, hitting the floor with a crack that echoed through the suddenly silent hallway. Parents who'd been chatting stopped mid-sentence. Teachers emerging from classrooms froze. Students waiting in line turned to stare. And Miss Bennett stood there, her face draining of color, looking at the handcuffs Kim was pulling from his belt. "You have the right to remain silent," Richards began, his voice carrying in the quiet. "The Miranda rights. That familiar recitation that everyone knows from television but sounds different when spoken in a school hallway, when spoken to a teacher being arrested in front of the community she'd worked in for years." Miss Bennett's head dropped, not in shame, but in an attempt to hide, to make herself smaller, to escape the stares of dozens of witnesses. Kim moved behind her, professional and efficient, securing the handcuffs with practiced clicks that sounded impossibly loud. Metal on metal, the sound of consequences. They led her toward the exit, and the path they took was the same one Sophie had walked 3 days earlier. Past room 214, past the side door where Miss Bennett had stood with her hand on the lock, choosing cruelty over compassion. The door she'd slammed on an 8-year-old girl was now closing on her entire future. Every parent watching understood the symbolism. Every teacher present felt the weight of the moment. This was what happened when you betrayed the trust given to those who teach children. This was justice, public and undeniable. The trial lasted 3 days, though anyone watching knew the outcome was decided long before the jury retired to deliberate. The prosecution presented their case with clinical precision, building layer upon layer of evidence that left no room for doubt, no space for alternative interpretations. This wasn't a complicated case requiring legal gymnastics or creative arguments. This was simply the documented truth, and the truth was damning. Dr. Martinez testified first, walking the jury through exactly what happens to a human body during hypothermia. She explained how Sophie's core temperature of 92.6 degrees represented a medical emergency, how another 15 minutes could have meant organ damage, how children are particularly vulnerable because of their smaller body mass and limited ability to generate heat. She showed the jury photographs of Sophie in the emergency room, the warming blankets, the IV lines, the monitors tracking a small body fighting to survive exposure it should never have faced. Medical experts followed, explaining the progression from discomfort to danger to life-threatening crisis. They testified that 47 minutes in those conditions, without proper clothing, would be dangerous for an adult and potentially fatal for a child. They demolished any suggestion that this had been harmless, that Sophie had merely been uncomfortable, that no real danger existed. The science was clear and unforgiving. Then came the students. 16 children, some as young as 8, took the witness stand and described what they'd seen. Their testimony was heartbreaking in its simplicity. They talked about the trap question, the laughter, Miss Bennett's rage. They described hearing Sophie knock on the door, watching their teacher ignore those knocks, sitting through a lesson on the water cycle while knowing their classmate was outside in the snow. Several children cried on the stand, not from fear of testifying, but from the guilt they still carried for not speaking up, for trusting that adults knew what was right. But the testimony that shattered Miss Bennett's defense completely came from an unexpected source, her own daughter. Madison Bennett, 9 years old, was called by the prosecution after information emerged during discovery that changed the entire narrative. Madison testified, with her grandmother present for support, about what life was like at home. She described her mother's obsession with her academic performance, the constant comparisons to other students, the bitter complaints about children like Sophie who made learning look easy while Madison struggled. Madison told the court about dinner table conversations where her mother would rant about show-off students who answered questions to make teachers look stupid, about the mounting resentment towards Sophie specifically, whose name Madison had heard repeatedly in the weeks leading up to that day, about her mother saying the night before that she was substituting for Sophie's class the next day, and maybe it was time someone taught that girl some humility. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as this 9-year-old described a pattern of jealousy and rage that had been building for weeks, that had targeted an 8-year-old child for the crime of being intelligent. Miss Bennett, sitting at the defense table, didn't look at her daughter during the testimony, couldn't, because Madison's words proved premeditation, proved that this wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, but a calculated act of cruelty born from months of resentment. The defense had nothing. They tried to argue that Miss Bennett had simply used poor judgment, that she hadn't intended harm, that the severity of the weather had been unexpected, but the evidence destroyed every argument. Weather reports showed the blizzard had been forecasted. Medical testimony proved the danger was immediate and obvious. Student witnesses established that Miss Bennett had locked the door deliberately, had ignored Sophie's knocking, had continued teaching as if nothing was wrong. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered guilty verdicts on all 3 charges: child endangerment in the first degree, willful neglect of a minor, abuse of authority. Miss Bennett's face remained blank, but her hands shook as the verdicts were read, as the judge thanked the jury and scheduled sentencing for the following week. Sentencing was swift and severe. The judge, a woman who'd spent 20 years on the bench and seen countless cases involving harm to children, didn't mince words. She spoke about the sacred trust given to educators, about the vulnerability of children placed in their care, about the unconscionable betrayal Miss Bennett had committed. The sentence, 4 years in state prison, followed by 5 years probation with conditions that included never working with children again, mandatory anger management and psychological counseling, and a permanent criminal record that would follow her for the rest of her life. Miss Bennett's teaching credentials were revoked immediately. Her career, the profession she'd worked in for years, was over. Not suspended, not under review, permanently destroyed. And as she was led from the courtroom, heading to begin serving her sentence, everyone present understood that justice had been served. Not perfectly. Nothing could undo what Sophie had endured, but completely. But the lawsuit was just beginning, because criminal consequences addressed Miss Bennett's actions. The civil case was about the system that had enabled her. The criminal conviction was the spark that ignited a wildfire through the entire school district. Once Miss Bennett was sentenced, once the criminal justice system had established beyond reasonable doubt that child endangerment had occurred, the civil lawsuit became not a question of if the district would lose, but how catastrophically they would fall. Rebecca Walsh's legal team went to work with surgical precision, peeling back layers of administrative negligence that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Discovery revealed that Miss Bennett's hiring process had been cursory at best, criminally negligent at worst. Background checks had been minimal. References had gone unchecked. Her previous disciplinary issues at other schools, complaints about inappropriate comments toward students, concerns about her temperament, had never been investigated because the district was desperate for substitute teachers and couldn't afford to be picky. The substitute screening process was exposed as a bureaucratic facade, a series of checkboxes that administrators rushed through to fill staffing gaps. There was no psychological evaluation, no assessment of fitness to work with children beyond a basic criminal record search. Miss Bennett had passed that low bar, and the district had given her authority over classrooms full of vulnerable children without ever asking if she should have it. But the failures went deeper. The investigation revealed that on the day Sophie was locked outside, multiple safety protocols had been ignored or never existed in the first place. There was no system for checking on substitute teachers during their shifts, no requirement for administrators to visit classrooms, no protocol for students to report concerning teacher behavior. The courtyard where Sophie had frozen didn't appear on any safety map, wasn't covered by any security camera, existed in a blind spot that the district had never bothered to address. Principal Anderson was placed on administrative leave, then quietly forced to resign when it became clear he'd received a complaint about Miss Bennett's treatment of students 2 weeks before the incident, and had done nothing. He'd filed the complaint in a drawer, marked it for later review, and forgotten about it. That later review never happened. Anderson's career ended not with a dramatic firing, but with a resignation letter and an understanding that he'd never work in education again. The assistant principal followed, then the HR director who'd approved Miss Bennett's hiring, then the district's risk management coordinator who'd signed off on safety protocols that existed only on paper. One by one, administrators who'd built careers on the presumption that nothing would ever go catastrophically wrong discovered that catastrophe had indeed arrived, and their negligence was documented in thousands of pages of depositions and evidence. The school board meetings became spectacles of accountability. Parents packed the auditorium, demanding answers, demanding changes, demanding assurance that what happened to Sophie could never happen to their children. Board members, realizing the enormity of the liability they faced, began throwing administrators under the bus in desperate attempts to save their own positions. The unity of bureaucratic protection crumbled under the weight of public outrage and legal exposure. The financial settlement, when it finally came, made state history. Rebecca Walsh had asked for $12 million in her original complaint. The district's insurance company, looking at the evidence and the public sentiment in the complete absence of any defensible position, recommended settling for $15 million, just to make it go away. The final number, negotiated over weeks of mediation, $18.4 million. The largest settlement in state history for a case involving a single student. But money, while significant, wasn't the victory Rebecca and Jake had fought for. The real changes came in the policy reforms that became mandatory as part of the settlement. Every substitute teacher in the district would undergo psychological evaluation and comprehensive background checks. Classroom monitoring systems would be installed, anonymous reporting hotlines for students, mandatory training on child safety and appropriate discipline, protocols requiring administrative presence during substitute coverage, security cameras covering every exterior door and courtyard. These policies, initially implemented in one district to settle one lawsuit, spread. Other districts, terrified of facing similar liability, adopted the same standards. State legislators, responding to constituent pressure, introduced bills making many of these safety measures legally required. Within a year, Sophie's case had reshaped education policy across the entire state, had created protections for hundreds of thousands of students who would never know her name but would benefit from the accountability her suffering had demanded. The district had fallen, not destroyed entirely, but fundamentally transformed, forced to rebuild with safety and accountability as foundational principles rather than afterthoughts. And through it all, through the firings and settlements and policy changes, through the news coverage and legislative hearings and administrative restructuring, Jake remained focused on one thing: not the money, not the systemic reforms, though he understood their importance, not even the satisfaction of watching the people responsible face consequences. Jake only cared about one thing: his daughter. The new school was different from the first moment Sophie walked through its doors. Meadowbrook Elementary sat on the other side of town, a building that had earned its reputation not through test scores or athletic achievements, but through something more fundamental, a culture that celebrated curiosity instead of punishing it. Teachers here understood that bright students weren't showing off when they raised their hands, weren't being disrespectful when they asked questions that pushed lessons further. Intelligence was nurtured, not resented. Sophie's transfer happened quietly without fanfare, though her story had preceded her. The principal, Mrs. Harrison, had personally assured Jake during the enrollment meeting that Sophie would be safe here, would be valued here, would never again face punishment for being exactly who she was meant to be. And Mrs. Harrison had kept that promise in ways large and small, from the careful selection of Sophie's teacher to the private conversations with classmates about kindness and inclusion before Sophie's first day. Her new teacher, Mr. Taylor, was a 15-year veteran who'd built his classroom into a sanctuary for students who thought differently, who learned faster, who needed more than standard curriculum could provide. He'd greeted Sophie on her first morning with genuine warmth and a question that immediately put her at ease. "I heard you know a lot about planetary mechanics. Would you be willing to help me plan our next science unit?" The students in her new class didn't whisper about her or treat her like she was fragile or damaged. They knew she'd been through something difficult. Children always know more than adults think they do, but they responded with the uncomplicated compassion that kids are capable of when given the chance. They asked if she wanted to join their reading group, invited her to sit with them at lunch, welcomed her into their games at recess without making a production of it. And slowly, day by day, Sophie began to heal in ways that no therapy session or legal victory could accomplish. She started raising her hand in class again without flinching, started answering questions without second-guessing whether her knowledge would be seen as showing off, started being the brilliant, curious, enthusiastic learner she'd always been before someone had tried to break that spirit. 2 months after her transfer, Mr. Taylor announced the annual science fair. Sophie's expression flickered with something complicated, interest mixed with old trauma, and Jake saw it immediately when she came home that afternoon. They talked about it over dinner, Sophie admitting she wanted to enter but was afraid, afraid of putting in the work and having it taken away, afraid of being punished again for trying her best. Jake had pulled out his phone and shown her a photo he'd kept, the original science project, the solar system with hand-painted planets and LED lights that she'd worked on for 3 weeks. The project that had been buried in snow and water damage beyond repair. "You built something amazing once," he told her, "and someone tried to destroy it, but they didn't destroy you. You want to build something new? We'll build it together." So Sophie did. She designed a new project, more ambitious than the first. A working model demonstrating how tidal forces from gravitational interactions could be harnessed for renewable energy. Jake helped where she needed it, but mostly he watched, amazed as always by how her mind worked, how she could take complex concepts and make them tangible. She worked with confidence this time, without the fear that had haunted her since that day in the snow. The science fair came on a Friday evening. The gymnasium filled with parents and students, displays covering every available surface, children standing proudly beside their work. And when the judges finished their rounds, when the scores were tallied and the winners announced, Sophie's name was called for first place. She walked to the front of the gymnasium, accepted her blue ribbon and certificate, and smiled. The kind of genuine, unguarded smile that Jake hadn't seen since before everything happened. Mr. Taylor shook her hand, told her, and everyone listening, that her project demonstrated not just scientific understanding, but creative problem-solving that went well beyond grade level. That she should be proud, that her intelligence was a gift to be celebrated. And Sophie, holding that blue ribbon, surrounded by applause, finally believed it again. She walked out of that gymnasium confident, safe, thriving. The girl who'd been punished for being smart had won first place for being brilliant. The child who'd been locked outside in the cold stood in warmth and recognition. Her talents finally valued the way they should have been all along. This was redemption. This was hope. This was Sophie reclaiming herself from the trauma that had tried to define her. But protection, real, lasting protection, required something more than a nurturing school and academic achievement. It required a message sent so clearly that no one would ever mistake it. What most people didn't know, what the news coverage never mentioned, was that Jake hadn't been alone through any of this. From the moment he'd carried Sophie through those school doors, from the first phone call he'd made after the hospital admitted her, the Brotherhood had been mobilizing. 250 Hells Angels, brothers from chapters across 3 states, had been watching everything unfold with the kind of protective fury that comes when one of your own has been wronged. They'd been there during the arrest, motorcycles lining the streets around the school, engines idling, leather-clad riders standing with arms crossed while Miss Bennett was let out in handcuffs. No one said a word. No threats were made. They just stood there, a silent wall of presence that communicated more than any words could. They'd been there during the trial, filling the courtroom gallery, their colors displayed proudly, making sure the judge and jury and everyone present understood that this case mattered, that this child was protected, that justice wasn't optional. And they were there now, on the day Sophie won first place at her science fair, gathering in the school parking lot as word spread through the brotherhood that Jake's daughter had reclaimed her brilliance, had stood in front of judges and parents, and won recognition for being exactly who she was meant to be. 250 motorcycles, Harleys and choppers and custom builds, rolled into Meadowbrook Elementary's parking lot as the sun began setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Sophie heard them first, that distinctive rumble that's unmistakable once you've heard it. She looked at her father with wide eyes, and Jake smiled, scooped her up onto his shoulders, and carried her outside. The sight that greeted them was overwhelming. Rows of motorcycles, brothers standing beside their bikes, all of them there for one 8-year-old girl who'd survived something no child should ever face. The engines revved in unison, a thunderous declaration that echoed off buildings and rolled through the neighborhood. Not a threat, a promise. This child is protected. This child is valued. This child will never stand alone against cruelty again. Parents who'd been leaving the science fair stopped to watch. Students pressed against windows, and Sophie sat on her father's shoulders, waving at an army of protectors who'd claimed her as their own. One of the brothers, a man named Hawk who'd ridden from 2 states away, approached Jake and handed Sophie a patch, custom made, designed specifically for her. It read, "Protected by 250, with a small angel wing embroidered beside the words. Sophie held it like a treasure, understanding in the way children do that this meant something important, something permanent. The message was clear. Touch this child, harm any child under the watch of this brotherhood, and consequences would follow. Not violence. They didn't need violence when justice had already been served. But presence, witness, the certainty that wrongdoing would be seen, documented, pursued with relentless determination until accountability was achieved. Miss Bennett had learned that lesson in prison. The school district had learned it through policy reform and financial devastation. And anyone watching this moment, seeing 250 motorcycles surrounding one small girl, understood it now. Jake had carried Sophie through a blizzard to save her life. The brotherhood carried her memory through every legal battle to save her future. And standing there in the sunset, surrounded by the rumble of engines and the solidarity of brothers who'd become her guardians, Sophie was safe, truly safe. Not because the people who had hurt her were gone, though they were, but because she was surrounded by protectors who had proven they would move heaven and earth to keep her from harm. The engines revved one final time, a thunderous chorus that felt like a heartbeat, and then they rode out. 250 motorcycles departing in formation, leaving behind the promise they'd made. No one would ever hurt her again. Sophie's story ended with justice because one father refused to stay silent, because he documented every failure, pursued every avenue of accountability, and built a case so comprehensive that the system had no choice but to respond. But it ended with protection because 250 brothers stood behind that father and behind his daughter, making sure the world understood that harming the vulnerable comes with consequences. If you believe children should be protected, not punished for their intelligence, hit subscribe. Comment "Stand with Sophie" if you're against anyone who hurts kids, and share the story because the world needs to know that cruelty against children will never go unanswered. 250 Hells Angels made sure of that, and the rumble of their engines still echoes as a reminder that when we stand together, when we refuse to accept injustice, when we fight for the defenseless with everything we have, we can change the world, one protected child at a time. Stand with Sophie. Stand against those who harm children. And never forget that sometimes justice rides on two wheels and wears leather, but it's justice all the same.